Holy Spirit just gives you just a prop when you didn't bring a prop, right? Because I was planning on opening up this morning, greeting you, and then just going silent. Because it leads into what we're talking about, and Holy Spirit helped me out with that. He just cut the microphone off. Good effect, God, we'll take it. A little awkward silence is, isn't it? It's a little awkward. There are certain areas in our life that silence isn't awkward, but what is so awkward about silence? Because when you go to a movie theater, you expect people to be quiet, right? You would hope they would be quiet. When they're not quiet, you shh and give them the dirty look, the stank eye, right? At weddings, you hope people are quiet, and you don't look around, I wonder how come nobody is saying anything. No, because that's the norm in a wedding. But why is it that silence isn't always received that way? Like when you're in a conversation with somebody and all of a sudden they just go silent. When you ask someone a question and they don't respond to you, it's a little awkward. It's probably annoying, isn't it? And so I think about silence, and today the title of the message this morning is When God is Silent. When God is silent. We're going to look at a couple people in the Bible who experienced the silence of God, and we're going to talk about how we need to view that silence, because silence isn't always a bad thing. Right? It's not always a bad thing. Let's look first at Psalm chapter 22. We don't have the words on the screen this morning. We have some technical difficulties with the computer. So for those who brought the Bible, or pull out your electronic devices and download the Bible app, this morning, Psalm chapter 22, verses 1 and 2, David says this: my God, why have you abandoned me? Why are you so far away when I groan for help? Every day I call to you, my God, but you do not answer. Every night you hear my voice, but I find no relief. If you're taking notes this morning, just put down point number 1, because the first thing we need to understand about silence is silence does not mean absence. Silence does not mean absence. Here David says, why have you abandoned me? He's calling out to God. He's not getting an answer. And so in his mind, God's left him. He's no longer there. Even though David goes on to say, every night you hear my voice. Well, if God hears your voice, that means he's there, right? If he hears your voice, then he's present. But oftentimes it's not enough for God to hear us. We need God to respond to us. I understand you always hear me, God, but I would like to have a little bit of response every now and then. I don't like the silent treatment that I feel sometimes, God. In Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 31, we see the disciples encounter the silence themselves, except this time Jesus was sleeping. In Mark chapter 4, verse 35, let's go ahead and read that. As evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, let's cross to the other side of the lake. If you're taking notes, make a point right there that this was Jesus' idea. Just remember this. This was Jesus' idea. So they took Jesus in the boat and they started out, leaving the crowds behind, although other boats followed. But soon a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. That means he was comfortable, right? I don't know if any of you have ever slept without a pillow, but I like to sleep with the pillow, and it's got to be the right texture of a pillow. Y'all know what I'm talking about? My in-laws have these big, thick pillows. They're great, but man, my neck feels like it's like, just sitting up high. It's like all the blood is rushing down. I gotta have just this beat up, battered, just soggy pillow. Y'all know what I'm talking about? As a comforting pillow. And so Jesus, it's interesting that Mark said he was sleeping with his head on a cushion. To me, that says Jesus was comfortable. He was out like a light. He was out. And the disciples woke him up shouting, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Silence, be still." Suddenly the wind stopped and there was a great calm. And then he asked them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" The disciples were absolutely terrified. "Who is this man?" they asked each other. "Even the wind and the waves obey him." Now, one thing you need to recognize about the disciples is most of these guys were fishermen. And so it was no surprise that they would be on a boat when a storm came. This wasn't the first storm they encountered in their life. They're quite familiar with storms, but there must have been something bad about this storm, enough for them to feel like they were about to drown. This had to be probably one of the greatest storms they've ever encountered in their life, and yet Jesus was silent. Think about that. The greatest storm they've ever encountered, and yet Jesus is silent. You ever went through a storm and you felt like, God, where are you? This is the biggest thing I've ever faced, God, and I'm not getting the response. I'm not getting the answer that I need. But just because he's silent doesn't mean he's not present. And look at these disciples, and because Jesus was silent, because he was sleeping, what they figured out that meant, they figured out, well, he must not care about us, because if Jesus cared about us, then he would do something. He wouldn't just sit in the boat and sleep. If he truly cared about me, he would do something. But two things the disciples failed to recognize. The first thing, going back to verse number 35, is it was Jesus' idea to get in the boat in the first place. It was Jesus' idea. And so if God or Jesus directed them to get into the boat, then don't you think Jesus would have known that a storm will be coming? Don't you think Jesus had a plan to lead them into safety? Have you ever followed God's guidance only to find yourself in an uncomfortable place? Have you ever obeyed God only to say, God, I obeyed you and it led me here? Why? I think about Joseph. Think about Joseph. He was granted, he was hated by his brothers, thrown in the pit, sold into slavery, but then things start picking up. He's in slavery, but he becomes like the head of the household under Potiphar. And so he's like in command of everything. Potiphar goes out of town. Joseph, you're in charge of the house. Sweet, Joseph has a pretty good gig going on. Even though he's a slave, he's a pretty good gig. And then Potiphar's wife takes a liking to Joseph. And then Potiphar's wife wants Joseph to come lie with her. And when I say lie, I don't mean tell fibs. Okay? Y'all got it. And Joseph, because of his love for God and because of his love for Potiphar, he says, I cannot do that because that would be sinning against God and that would be disrespecting Potiphar, so I'm going to politely refuse your advances. And she didn't like that. And she accuses him of rape. And Joseph ends up going to prison because he did the right thing. Had he just slept with her, he wouldn't have found himself in prison. But that's not a good reason to sleep with somebody that's not your wife. And so here Joseph he's doing what's right. He's following God, and it leads him into prison. It leads him into an uncomfortable spot. Yet in that spot is where God introduces him to the butler and the baker. In that spot is where Joseph has the connections he needs to eventually get to where God's taking him. So you see there was purpose in his prison. Now you can look at the prison and you can perceive that through the prison that God must have forgotten about me. God must have abandoned me. But there was a purpose in his prison, and there's a purpose in whatever storm you find yourself in as well. Because if Jesus called you into this thing, and if your life is a life that is obediently following him, then storms will come, and he might get silent, but that doesn't mean he's absent from your life. The second thing that they needed to recognize was that Jesus was still in the boat. And if they go down, then guess what? Jesus has to go down with them. And the fact that he's in the boat should have told the disciples that he's still in control. And I can guarantee you in your life, whatever storms you find yourself in, however rocky you feel like your boat has gotten, Jesus hasn't abandoned ship. He's still in there with you, which means his silence doesn't equal his absence. And just like he did with the disciples, he'll speak to that storm when the time is right and tell it to be still. And we love when Jesus tells the storm to be silent, but we don't love it when Jesus is silent himself. Right? Please silence my storms, but don't be silent on me, Jesus. But I wonder if there's a purpose behind God's silence in our life. I feel like there is. I feel like there is a purpose in his silence. Because looking at this story, if you have a God that is great enough and powerful enough to be mad at because he didn't stop your suffering, then you also have a God who's great enough and powerful enough to have reasons that you can't understand. I mean, if he's powerful enough that you're going to say, God, why didn't you do this? If you can get mad at him because you felt like he could stop it, then you got to also trust that he might have a purpose in it, right? You got to trust that his silence is not always a negative thing, that there's a purpose behind that silence. And it doesn't mean that he's not there. When David says this, my God, why have you abandoned me? He's associating God's silence with his absence, but that's not the case. And anyone who has ever had children knows that's not the case. I have 4 kids. One is louder than the others. My 3-year-old has 1 gear, high gear. Right? She has 1 decibel. It is loud. She doesn't wind down at nighttime. You have to wind her down. And so when the kids are playing, especially my 3-year-old, and she's being loud and being rowdy, you can hear her in the other room. When she goes silent, I don't just automatically assume she's disappeared, right? I don't just say, oh no, maybe she's not in the house anymore. What do you say as a parent when your kid all of a sudden goes silent? Uh-oh, right? They are up to something. Yeah, you got to go check on it quickly, because when they go silent, they're up to something. And when God goes silent in our life, could it be not that he's absent, but could it be that he's up to something? Could it be that the reason he goes quiet is because maybe God's working on something, and you have no idea what it is in your life? God is up to something. Turn to your neighbor and say, God's up to something. He was up to something in Job's life. Job was no stranger to suffering. I mean, he experienced so much. And it came, I almost said it. Sorry, I almost started singing this song by Miley Cyrus. It came in like, you know what, if you know the song. It came in like that, like a wrecking ball. And that's how, I don't listen to Miley Cyrus, guys. I work at Verizon, and this stuff plays all the time, so I'm subject to the evil music of the world. So I got to put my earphones in and sing praise and worship. But it came in like a wrecking ball in Job's life, and here he is. Everything's going fine. He's rich. He's got a good family. And then he loses his family. He loses his kids. He gets these sores on his body. I mean, you've heard the phrase, when it rains, it pours. That's Job's life. It's not just one thing that goes wrong. Everything goes wrong, and it happens, boom, 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 in his life. And here Job is, during this time that things are happening, and bad things are happening, and God is silent. It's like crickets. God's not saying anything. As a matter of fact, it's actually Job's friends who will come, and they'll attempt to provide answers. Those good old friends, right? Well, Job, maybe because you have a sin in your life. Because people automatically assume when something goes wrong, that must mean you're in sin. You need to straighten up, right? Okay, maybe I've never experienced that before, never been accused of that in your life. But that's not always the case. Yeah, some things people bring on themselves, but sometimes it's tests that are involved. And here Job's friends are trying to provide answers, or trying to make sense of it. They're trying to offer consolation while God is silent. And Job, eventually, as he gets to the point before God starts to respond, in Job chapter 30, verse number 20, he says, I cry to you, God, but you don't answer. I stand before you, but you don't even look. He goes on in verse 21 and 22, you have become cruel toward me. You use your power to persecute me. You throw me into the whirlwind and destroy me in the storm. There again, he's jumped to conclusions, all because of God's silence. So the disciples, because Jesus is silent, he must not care. Job, because God is silent, that must mean it's God that's causing all this persecution. It's God that's causing all this destruction in his life. All because God is silent. And it seems like to me that Job's biggest struggle is not the loss, it's not the pain. His biggest struggle is God's silence. That he feels like God's abandoned him. And maybe that's your story in life. Maybe you say, you know what? Everything that I'm going through, they wouldn't be so bad if I at least felt like God was with me. If I felt like God was giving me some answers. If God wasn't so silent, then maybe I could get through some of this stuff that I'm getting through with it, that I'm going through right now. But one thing we need to recognize, and the second point I want to make about silence, is silence doesn't mean that God doesn't have an answer. It doesn't mean he doesn't have an answer. It doesn't mean he doesn't have a plan. Because what Job didn't know was that one day Satan was walking around to and fro, and God said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? And y'all are like, God, if you ever talk to Satan, please do not throw my name in the mix. Pretend like you don't know. The only time, God, you can pretend like you don't know me is when you're having a conversation with Satan. And pretend like I don't even exist. Little did Job know that God suggested him to Satan. But also little did Job know that God said, Satan, you can do this, you can do that, but you can't kill him. Little did Job know that God put restrictions on it. Because when we're in the midst of a storm and we're in the midst of a battle, we don't see all the restrictions that God has put on the enemy, do we? We think the enemy's just having a heyday, just pounding on us, right? Everything goes. God has just released his protection and his security over our life, and he has just let the enemy give it 125%. But what we don't realize is that God says you can only go this far. He's still in control, right? He's still in control. He's had conversations with Satan. And I wonder this morning what kind of conversations God's had with Satan over your life. I wonder what kind of things God has said. Satan, you can't do this to him. You can take it this far, but I'm not going to allow you to take it any further than this. And here you're wondering if it's going to drop off at any moment. You're going to drop off the face of the earth, and God just puts that blockage there. I wonder how many conversations God has had with angels that you're not aware about, saying, you know what, at this time I need you to come in and just offer that protection. At this time, come in and just speak to him and minister to him. Wonder how many conversations he's had that we're not aware of. Just because he's silent doesn't mean he doesn't have the answer. How many of you are pretty good students in school? Anybody? And of those that were good, I was a pretty good student in school, but you can probably relate to this. For the teachers who would always ask the obvious question, and would you respond when you knew the answer? Some of you probably would. I didn't. A lot of times, I didn't. I knew the answer. The teacher would ask silly answers like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what kind of questions, but they would ask questions, and it would just, you know the answer. It's a no-brainer, but for some reason you just. And the teacher's like, huh? Who knows the answer? Huh? And you know it, but you don't speak it. Why? Maybe because you're embarrassed. Maybe you don't want to be like the smart kid in school, and you're afraid of all the ridicule. You got a reputation to protect, and so you don't want to let people think you're like a smart nerd or anything. You got all these reasons, right? But the whole point of that is you know the answer to the question, but you're just not saying it. So you're silent, but doesn't mean you don't know the answer, right? Just because when God's silent doesn't mean he doesn't know the answer. And also, the third thing when God is silent is it doesn't mean that he hasn't already said something. When God is silent, it doesn't mean that he hasn't already said something. My kids recently, they wanted to go swimming. And so they each asked me on separate occasions, can we go swimming? And I said, no. And I have my reasons, right? As a parent, you don't have to give the reasons, but you have your reasons. No. And so they keep asking me, right? And they keep asking me. And I would be okay if they each asked one time. But they kept asking. And eventually it got to the point to where my answer was always no. So you know what I said? When they said, Daddy, can we go swimming? I just looked up and walked away. Daddy, why don't you answer us? Can we go swimming? Daddy, answer us. Why? You already know the answer. My silence means that you already know the answer, but you don't like the answer, so you keep asking the question. Oh, I'm preaching better than y'all are letting on. You don't like God's answer, and so you keep tugging at him, asking that same question, and God is silent. Why are you silent, God? Because he's already given you the answer. He's already given you the answer. Now we just have to accept that answer, don't we? Sometimes God's silence is because we know the answer, we just have to recognize or embrace the answer. Our worship team, you guys can go ahead and come up, because I'm going to need some sappy music. I'm about to tell a story about me and Valerie. It's a good old sappy, like Righteous Brothers. Can you play Righteous Brothers? Can you play that? Before his time, he said, before my time too. You don't have to play Righteous Brothers, I'm just kidding. But me and Valerie were, last night, she found this book before we started dating. She had this folder of all the emails I sent her when we first started talking, right? And she pulls it out. She's reading all the emails and all the things that I said. She's like, honey, did you keep my emails? Let me go look in that box in the attic. Let me see. Thankfully, Pat said the computer crashed. Thankfully, there's this thing called folders in your email. I ain't printed up not a nary one of them, but thank God that Hotmail saved it in that folder. Click and drag, baby, click and drag. I had all of them there, right? And mine wasn't that thick. Mine was just a boom, there it is, right? And so I started reading her emails, and it was sappy, right? It was just a sappy time of us reminiscing about when we were just dating. And so sweet. But you need to know something about how it came to be. You need to know, before I read this email from her, that, no, she didn't give me permission. Sometimes in life it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. You might want to leave right now. I'm just kidding. It's not that bad. But when we first met, or before we met, I had this feeling, right? You just know. Sometimes you know. I knew that she was the one that God had for me, and she needed a little more convincing. She wasn't quite as sensitive to the Holy Spirit as I was, so she needed a little more convincing in life. And I knew the answer, but she didn't know the answer. And there's a backstory as to why she didn't know the answer. Because there was a guy, she had just gotten out of a tough relationship. There was a guy that really wasn't all he said he was, right? Oh, don't leave now, man. Don't leave now. He proposed to be, not proposed in general, but acted like he was this and that, and he really just let a lot of people down. He wasn't who he thought he was. And it kind of is disappointing, right? When you put all your, you feel like this person is this, but then they just turn around on you. And it was hard for Val. I can't speak like personally for her, but from what she's communicated to me, it was hard for her because, she didn't want to step into another relationship because she saw this guy but he turned out not to be this and that. So you can naturally understand why she would be a little apprehensive about jumping into a relationship with me, because who's to say that's not going to turn out the same way, right? And so she's a little nervous about this. God is silent on the issue, and then all of a sudden she remembers something that was said about a year before that. And I want to read this email that she wrote to me on April 21st of 2002. Hey, honey snipples. I'm just kidding. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. I'm going to read the kind of the middle part of the email. She says, whether you see it or not, you've already been an answer to prayer for me. I won't go into great detail tonight, but I will later. I'm going to try not to be scared, so pray hard. I don't want to be afraid of what God has, so just keep on praying for me. I'll come around. You kind of hear where she's coming from here? Like, I'm thinking, hey, this is God. And she's saying, I just don't know. I just haven't gotten the clarity yet. Just keep praying for me. I'll come around. And then she goes on to say, something's been eating at me. We have this woman in our church, Miss Clara, a mighty prophet of God. She's in her 70s. She told me before I got accepted to lead that she didn't feel that Jonathan, who was the zero she dropped before she got her hero. If he's watching, we love you, brother. She said that Miss Clara said she didn't feel Jonathan and I were going to be together much longer. And she saw a complete turnaround in my life, meaning a lot was about to change. And here's Valerie's words. I was scared to lose him, is what she told the lady. I'm scared to lose him. And the lady says, Valerie, God has his hand on you. You're not going to even have to worry about missing Jonathan, because God is going to bless you with someone else. Someone else being the right man God has. And then she stopped. And all of a sudden, this lady began to say, as if she had a word from God, oh, this summer, Valerie, this summer, it's going to happen. This summer. Something different. I don't know exactly what, but something's going to happen. This summer, it's going to be of God, and it's going to be good. And it was that summer. And so here this whole time that Valerie is distressed over Jonathan disappointing her and over things not working out and him being so different, and she's afraid to step back into it. God is silent on the issue, but all of a sudden her mind goes back to what God's already said. Because God, in my mind, was folding his arms and saying, I'm not going to say anything else because you already have the answer. You just got to remember what I said. You just have to go back to what I'm saying. Sometimes the silence of God is a response in our life. It's a response that's saying, remember what I said. Just because I'm silent doesn't mean that I haven't already spoken. I don't need to say anything else at this time. I just need you to remember what I've already said. And in your life, there may be things things that God is silent on. And you're saying, God, why aren't you speaking? And God is saying, I already have. Remember the answer. Go back to what I said. Things haven't changed. Just because I'm silent, it doesn't mean I'm absent. It doesn't mean I don't have an answer. It doesn't mean I don't have a plan. And it doesn't mean I haven't already spoken. My silence is my response. His silence is his response. I want to play a short clip here of this song. If you want to write this down and go back and listen to this whole song, you can. It's a guy named Anthony Evans, and the song is called Silence. Appropriate, huh? Silence. Such a great song that ministers to me, and I'm going to let the band bring it down just for a second. We're going to play just a small, just the last part of this chorus and let that soak in, and then the band's going to pick back up playing, and we're going to have a time of prayer. But listen to this part here. Can y'all hear that? Maybe you're speaking in this silence. You guys go ahead and pick it back up. Maybe it's all I need to hear. Give me the patience through this trial. I need to rest here. Go back and listen to the rest of the words of that song. Such a powerful song. Just because God is silent in our lives, again, maybe he's saying something through that silence. I'm reminded of when Elijah was brought to the cave. And God sends the earthquake. He sends the wind, the fire, the earth, wind, and fire. And all those things you expect God to be in the loudness. He's a mighty God, right? Our mighty God has to speak with thunder in his voice. He has to boom when he speaks. He has to have the James Earl Jones voice, right? But that's not how God spoke to Elijah. It was the still small voice. It was in the silence that Elijah had to listen to what God was saying. God, we thank you that in the moments of our deepest silence, that we can still find you. That our silence is not a sign of your abandonment, God. And it's not a sign that you're not speaking, and it's not a sign that you haven't already spoken. But it's in those moments, God, that we need to look to you and say, God, help us to embrace this silence. Help us to rest in this silence. Help us to know that you have a purpose in this, Father. Help us not to grow weary and help us not to doubt, but let us surrender to you, Jesus, in these moments, knowing that you still love us dearly. His silence is not a sign that he doesn't love you. As the worship gets ready to sing, if you're here this morning, you say, Pastor, that speaks to me. I'm going through some things right now that I'm really asking God for his help and his advice on, but I'm getting nothing. Let me just tell you guys that I wasn't going to preach this morning. This whole week I had my mind on something else. I was starting to flesh it out, but last night I just had a blockage. Could not finish it. Throw it up, start with something else. Going good, couldn't finish it. Getting frustrated. I was like, God, you chased it on me, God. I need to, and I'm just laying there. I'm like, God, what do I need to speak about? I can't get anything. God, it's like you're silent. silent. And then from that moment on, everything started echoing. Valerie and I started talking about something, and she's like, and she didn't even know I'd just been down there talking like that. And she's like, well, honey, you just don't need to be silent about this. Okay, that's the second time I've heard silence. And then I get to read something, and I'm not reading anything associated with silence, but out of the blue, there's that word silence again. And I said, okay, God, I get the picture. He spoke with silence, through the silence. And I felt like I needed to say this morning. So God spoke to my heart in the silent moments. And you say, Pastor Jeremy, I'm in a silent moment right now. Maybe God wants to give you an answer this morning, or maybe God just wants you to hang in there and trust Him. Whatever that might be, we want to pray with you. If that's you this morning, we invite you to come. Brothers and sisters in Christ will surround you, cover you with their love, cover you with their prayers, and believe that God will give you the grace you need in those silent moments.